Welcome to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. In this episode, we'll be listening to Speak Out, Legislative Activism 101, a session that was presented at Winter Institute 2025 in Denver, Colorado.
Okay, we can get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to some of you who were here same time yesterday. And for those of you who are here for the first time, who don't know me already, I'm Philomena Polifrone, she, her. I am the Associate Director of American Booksellers for Free Expression, which is ABA's Free Expression Initiative. So today, the session is about legislative advocacy, but really, this session is about turning booksellers into a political force. Because, yeah, that's an applause line. Because we can be, right? Because, as I'm going to explain, it's not just about that there are so many of us and we are in so many places, though we are, and that's great. It's also that we have two secret weapons. One, small businesses. That is everyone. There are about 2 or 3 things left that are still bipartisan. One of them is that everyone is supposed to support a small business, and everyone says that they do. We get to call them on it, and we get to present receipts about what does or does not help small business. 2, the other superpower, all of you have so many relationships in your community, and you have a platform, right? And using those 2 things together, those relationships that make you someone who people listen to, and the platform that lets you mobilize people, that's the thing that takes us from being, a network of a few thousand voices to exponentially more than that, right? So what I'm going to do today is focus on crafting testimony. I'm not going to focus so much on the kind of mobilizing your customers part. I think that part, keep an eye on emails that come from us. If you're not already getting our advocacy emails, you can stop by the advocacy desk, which is near where you registered. And there's a QR code there that will sign you up. And you can also follow our Instagram, which is at @FreeExpression. And we also have just jumped over to Blue Sky for reasons I probably don't need to explain. But all of those things, that's where, I can send you resources state by state when there are bills that we want to mobilize on. But today, I'm going to focus on how you, as booksellers, actually craft your testimony for when you are either emailing your legislators to tell them that you do or don't like a bill, or when you are going in person to the state capitol in your state and signing up to testify on legislation. So that's the plan. The slides will be available through the app and on our website afterwards. I included some more examples than we'll have time to go through, hoping that people will find the slides and go watch them later. And there aren't any particular handouts for this, but there are other resources on our website. And of course, you can always reach out to me. Before we get started, a brief but important message that you've heard several times already, I'm sure. Booksellers are encouraged to share ideas and support during the conference, but the Sherman Antitrust Act prohibits them from discussing price or pricing policies, boycotts, or dividing up the market. And if you have questions about that, you can find more on BookWeb or talk to David Grogan, who is at the advocacy desk. He loves talking about antitrust, seriously. So I already said a little bit about why we're here, right? But that was the optimistic version. The more pessimistic version is that a huge number of bills are moving through state legislatures right now, as they have been for decades, actually, but especially in this moment since 2020, that are either trying to make it easier to ban books or harder to ban books. So the easier to ban books, that's the bad news. The good news is that more and more states, particularly those with a Democratic trifecta in both houses and the governor, are trying to shore up support for books and make it actually harder to ban books by being proactive in the legislation that we're passing. So I'm focusing a little bit more on what I refer to as the whack-a-mole side, which is whenever a new bill comes up, we're doing everything we can to quash it because that impacts more states. But everything that I'm going to say can be tweaked in support of these proactive bills that make it harder to ban books. Most of these bills impact schools and libraries. It started with schools. It started with elementary schools. Before long, it was K through 12. And then before long, it was public libraries. And as many of you know, especially folks from Texas and Arkansas who are in the room, some of these bills have impacted booksellers directly. There are some bills that would impact booksellers directly that are moving through the legislature right now, or at least have been introduced, and we're watching them closely to see if they move. But for the most part, these are going to impact schools and libraries. So as booksellers, you're showing up as community members, but also as people who support literacy education and support libraries and support the creation of the next generation of readers, because that's our market, right? When a book impacts booksellers and it goes, or when a bill impacts booksellers and goes into law, we do challenge it. You've probably heard about our ongoing litigation against HB 900 in Texas and our ongoing litigation against Act 372 in Arkansas. Both of these so far have been successful, but when it's a school or a library issue, ABA and booksellers don't have legal standing. So the best thing that we can do is mobilize against it in the first place. And also, challenging these bills is expensive and an extremely drawn-out process. So if we can defeat them first, that's the best thing that we can do. Okay. So here briefly is the agenda. I want to talk about the life cycle of a bill. Sorry, Schoolhouse Rock fans, I will not be singing it. I'll also go into a little bit more detail into the types of book ban bill that we've seen introduced over the past 5 years, but also ones that are moving through the legislature right now. I'll give you 5 steps for effective testimony, some traps to avoid, and then examples. And we have our exemplary testifier here, our expert witness, Charlie from Book People. And then, many of you know this, not all of you know this, I used to teach writing at Columbia for a long time, so I'm going to run this a little bit like a writing workshop. That's why I asked you to get a pad of paper or take out your phone or something. We're actually going to get you started on outlining your testimony so that it's a little bit less scary, to get you past that blank page point so that when you need to, you can mobilize more quickly. Okay? So we use as much time as we have for that. All right. Let's talk about the life cycle of a bill. It's supposed to be the Schoolhouse Rock version, right? But in practice, it can actually feel more like being bulldozed. In some cases, as the bills are moving through the legislature, it's supposed to be a reflection of the voice of the people. But in a lot of cases, we just have to accept that they're going to do what we want them to do. They're not going to do what we want them to do. They're going to do what they want to do. And that is more often motivated by special interests, particularly where there's a trifecta in one direction or another. So I include this to kind of manage expectations a little. There's a lot that we can do. We're not always going to be able to defeat every bill, no matter how unjust or even unconstitutional it is. But what I've learned in doing this work is that showing up and making your voice heard is worth it, not just in terms of movement building, but more specifically, if there's litigation later, that it becomes there is actually a legal version of the I told you so argument that becomes kind of important, right? So showing up and saying, we told you that this was going to be a problem and you ignored it, that becomes useful later on down the line. Here's how a bill moves through the legislature, just briefly. It's introduced in the first chamber, either the House or the Senate in a given state. Some states only have one chamber, but most have 2. Once it's introduced, it's referred to a committee that is specifically focused on a certain topic. That can be education or judiciary or something like that. The committee will either table it or put it to the floor for a vote, at which point all of the people in that chamber will vote on it. And then it goes to the second chamber. It goes through the whole process again. If it clears both chambers, then it makes it to the governor, and he'll either sign it or veto it, right? In some cases, if there's a supermajority, they can overcome the veto. But in certain moments, one house or the other house or the governor will be the person who it makes the most sense to target. Each of those is going to imply a slightly different approach. But these are the areas when it makes sense to call or write, to launch a campaign, to start sending letters, and potentially to mobilize your customers as well, to reach out and to mobilize your community. So calling it and writing the committee that is hearing the bill, that's something that anyone can do, particularly if you're in a district where your representative or senator is on the relevant committee. Or if it goes to the governor, that's a moment to write and ask either to veto or not to veto a bill, right? What we're focusing on here in terms of testimony is the committee phase, right? That is the easiest place to kill a bill. That's where we can go in and, one, make our voices heard, but two, all they have to do is not act on it. If they don't take a vote and the period runs out, it dies on the table, as it were. The most effective type of testimony is in person. The next most effective is virtual testimony on Zoom. And the last is written testimony, which you sometimes, as in the case of Texas, still have to submit that written testimony in person. You still have to go to the state capitol. That is absolutely a tactic to limit who is able to speak up about certain bills, right? But even that written testimony, even though it's hard and even though it's the least effective, it's still very much worth doing, right? For all the reasons that we've already talked about. If it's possible for you to go in person to testify on a bill, I would encourage you to work with whatever grassroots organizations you have nearby, because they're often coordinating this, and they can give you, and I can often connect you with them, so reach out to me, but they can give you the most up-to-date intel on when to put pressure and where to put pressure, and if you can only travel to the state capitol once, whether to do it for the House or the Senate. So all of that, and also they can help you sort of split up the message so that different speakers are giving different parts of testimony to kind of come together into one big message with a lot of different perspectives, right? So again, reach out to me. I can connect you with any kind of grassroots mobilization in your state. And one other thing to mention is that sometimes bills will be referred to multiple committees. So sometimes it'll go to Ways and Means, and then it will go to Education. Think about where your argument is going to be most relevant. If the argument that you want to make is that these people have no idea how much it's actually going to cost the state, then that's an argument that you want to make where they're in the committee that is, Ways and Means, something that is thinking about the cost of things. If your argument is about the impact on students, you want to talk about it in the Education Committee. If it's about criminalizing booksellers or something like that, then talk about it in Judiciary. So sometimes it'll have different stages in the referral. And I also want to emphasize that you have two chances in most states to testify in committee, when it's in the first chamber, the House or the Senate, or the second chamber. So both should have committee assignments and chances to testify. All right, so let's talk about some of the types of bill that we're seeing. There are many different approaches that we've seen, but here are a few that I want to highlight. An extremely disturbing trend that emerged last year is that states are starting to try to ban books statewide instead of leaving it up to communities and school districts. So in Utah and in South Carolina, this is what we've seen, and it's been devastatingly effective. So in Utah, it's a 3 strikes bill. So if a book is banned in 3 school districts under certain conditions, then it's banned statewide unless there's a hearing to defend the book. And in South Carolina, it's direct appeals to the State Board of Education, who then hold a tribunal to talk about whether this book should be banned statewide. If they don't read it, they hate reading. That's the thing, right? This is what we're up against. And the range of books that have been banned reflect the national trend, which is to say that they disproportionately impact marginalized voices. So it's a really devastating tactic, and I'm sorry to tell you that Texas has introduced a bill that is trying to do the same thing. I expect that any state that has shown an inclination to ban books and passed bills making it easier to ban books, I would expect any of those states to pursue this tactic if it's open to them over time, whether it's this session or next. The next one, and I would say this one is probably the most common, is mandating that schools or public libraries create requests for reconsideration policies or acquisition policies that are restrictive of certain types of books. That's often based on sexual content, but they'll make those definitions so broad that it's actually, in my view, in the view of most of the judges who have ruled on this, unconstitutional, because they're broadening that definition of what is censorable content so far. But there are also other shady things that they can do in mandating those processes, like, for example, keeping librarians and media specialists off of the committees that decide whether to recommend to keep or remove a book, or having the school board or even the principal or some rando that the principal designates be the one to decide whether a book is banned. So essentially taking the voice of the people in the actual community out of the loop at every step of the way, right? On the other hand, sometimes it's useful in proactive bills to make it harder to ban books. Sometimes they can intervene in that process and say, okay, if you're going to have a book removal policy, you need to have librarians and media specialists on it. The book can't be removed unless it, is agreed to by this committee that it has to be removed, and other things like that that act as safeguards. Now, these last two, these are the ones that impact booksellers directly. In the United States, we have, there are certain guidelines for what counts as legally obscene, constitutionally speaking, and what's the very narrow set of things that are not protected by the First Amendment. Briefly, those things are governed by something called the Miller test, which is a 3-pronged test that means that taken as a whole, the work has to be patently offensive, it has to appeal to prurient or sexual interest, again, as a whole. And finally, and this is the kicker that they love to ignore whenever they can, in order to be considered obscene, a work has to lack serious artistic, literary, scientific, or political value. And sometimes there are other types of value included in there. Now, that's an extremely high bar. Even some things that I think we would all agree are created in order to be pornography, right? Even some of those are not necessarily going to fulfill that last criterion. And certainly, books by Toni Morrison do not, like, I'm a former English professor. I die a little bit every time someone says that a Toni Morrison book lacks serious literary artistic value. I mean, it's preposterous, right? And so they have to ignore that provision in order to, with a straight face, claim that these books they're banning are obscene. So the bills that are moving through now are trying to weaken those standards. There's one bill in Texas that I'm really concerned about, SB 88 or HB 1012, that essentially takes out the requirement to consider the work as a whole. So if there's a single passage that you could make the argument is legally obscene, then it doesn't matter what the rest of the book is doing. So that allows you to treat Beloved like it's Hustler magazine, right? Or like it's pornography. And that's the goal. And the reason that this is a huge threat for booksellers is because it would become a problem not only to sell books to minors that could fall afoul of this new definition, but even to display things in a way that minors could access. So these bills are unconstitutional, but the point of them is to invite a challenge that will eventually make its way to the Supreme Court and allow the Supreme Court to issue new legal precedent that would change the way we understand obscenity. That's the longer term strategy. So believe me, I have no illusions about our Supreme Court, but people who have been in this fight for a lot longer than me and who are actual First Amendment lawyers have told me that they don't think the Supreme Court would want to do that, but I really don't want to leave it to chance, right? So the best thing we can do is mobilize and defeat these bills. And then the last one that many of you probably know about are bills that force booksellers to rate books. This is what we saw in HB 900 in Texas, which we are in an ongoing case challenging. The case has been enjoined, meaning it's not in effect. We're in the ongoing appeals process, but so far, even the Fifth Circuit, which everyone says is like the weird circuit that just loves to make crazy decisions that even piss off the Supreme Court, right? Even the Fifth Circuit so far has ruled in our favor, right? So that should tell you exactly how unconstitutional this is. Go ahead. This is a good question. So let me answer this in two stages. One, these bills will create sometimes completely nonsensical standards by which you're supposed to rate books. So I don't know, does anyone feel confident that they could tell the difference between a book that is sexually explicit and sexually relevant? Because I don't. I don't know what that means. And yet, booksellers in Texas, if HB 900 had gone on the books as written, would have been forced to go through every book they had ever sold to a school district that was in active use and rate it according to those vague categories, which means they would have to reread all of those books. Nobody can do that. And so in practice, it would essentially force booksellers to discontinue their business relationships with schools. So the second part of your really excellent question is that I do think that there is a longer term strategy to try to create some kind of book rating system like we see with movies, like with the MPA issues. That would have a seismic impact on the production of literature, not to mention the sale of literature. And those ratings could also be manipulated by people who are ascendant in power and would like to silence voices, right? So it is not at all inconceivable to me that a book with queer characters would be, automatically at least PG-13 or something like that. And that's unacceptable. So the good news about the book rating bills is, although we saw HB 900 essentially cloned in different states last year, so far this year, we haven't seen it. And I'm going to come back to that because a case study for the New Hampshire booksellers who mobilized and defeated a book rating portion of a bill in their state last year. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to speed up a little bit because, once I get talking about bill numbers, it just all, I go into a haze. So 5 steps for effective testimony. The general principle here is that we're looking for the bipartisan argument, which is not necessarily going to be the argument you personally are most pumped about. Like, I would love to go in and decry all of the things that I think are abhorrent about book bans, right? But actually, the argument that it might make the most sense for me to go in and make is, hey, this is really bad for business, and you're supposed to care about that, right? And so that's effectively the message that you're going to get sick of hearing from me is just go with the argument that works, and that's usually going to be about money. So step 1 is strategize, and here you need to think about your audience. And again, small business is our secret bipartisan weapon. So if you can reasonably make a claim that a given bill is going to be bad for business in terms of making it harder for people to come into your store or discover your content or something like that, or you're able to reasonably claim, as has happened in Arkansas and Texas, that complying with the law will put undue expense on you and make it harder for you to just stay in business and do the things you have to do. Or if you can make an argument that a bill about that impacts education is going to worsen the career prospects of students in that state, that's the argument that you need to make. Again, it's not the sexy argument, but if it's effective, we just need to keep pressing that button as many times as we can. Another step 2 here is to introduce yourself. And when you're introducing yourself, you're not just saying your name and where you're from, though that's important, especially the where you're from part, because you need to prove that you're a constituent, especially if you're the constituent of someone on the committee, right? But you also need to say why they should care about you in particular. Why are you someone they should listen to, even if they really don't want to? So again, that's about your district. Are you a constituent? But as small businesses, as small business owners especially, you are a job creator, right? That's something that they're all supposed to care about, and that's something that can make them vulnerable as politicians. You also, as independent small businesses, have a disproportionate economic impact versus other businesses. So small businesses, as you know, circulate money back into the economy, not just by creating jobs, but also by working with other small businesses, the print shop down the street. Maybe you have some kind of deal with a coffee shop nearby or something people come to your store and they also go get a coffee. Our report called Unfulfilled, which you can search if you just search BookWeb, Unfulfilled, Amazon, you'll find our report on the impact of small businesses versus Amazon and big box stores. Small businesses circulate money back into their local economies at 4 times the rate of Amazon and at 2 times the rate of big box stores and other chains. So that's the kind of argument that you can make here. And so when you're introducing yourself, think about how you can show that you're someone who is doing something that they like, right? And that if you stop existing, or if it becomes harder for you to have the impact that you have, that's going to trickle out and impact a whole bunch of their other constituents who are then going to be pissed off at them, right? Because it always comes back to that. It always comes back to them just wanting to protect their power and protect their job. And so small business is one approach, but also you're all citizens of the place where you live, right? And think about what parts of that role you can lean on. Maybe you have a stake in schools or libraries if your kids go to the school, if you use the library, if your kids use the library. Anything to show that you're not just some passerby who's mad about this, you actually are a stakeholder. Step 3 is the lead. Remember all that annoying, again, I'm a writing teacher, remember all that annoying stuff about writing a thesis statement? That's what we're talking about here, right? You need to get the 1-sentence version of your argument. You need to get it out right in front. And I'm going to say later that you need to repeat it at the end. And here's part of the reason why this is so important is because, normally you'll have 2 or 3 minutes to speak, depending on the state. But as is about to happen in Texas this week, when there are a whole lot of people lined up to give testimony, sometimes they're going to say, okay, actually, you each only have 30 seconds, right? So you need to figure out how to prepare your argument in a way that can be cut down, and getting that 1-sentence introduction of yourself, 1-sentence argument, that might be all you have time to say. But even if it's not, that's the way that you can kind of cut through the noise of what everyone else is saying. And here are some examples, right? You're urging them to oppose the bill because this bill would unfairly burden small businesses. This bill will be impossible or expensive to comply with. It'll close your doors to minors. It will deter young readers, or it will create a hostile atmosphere for your business, right? And that hostile atmosphere for business, that's a way that you can bring your impact as small businesses into bills that are impacting schools and libraries. Because we all know that when this pops off in a school or a library, it very easily spills over into a store, right? So if you can make that connection, that's the argument. Step 4, receipts. Essentially, this is evidence, but you need to Anticipate an audience who, again, really doesn't want to listen to you, wants to ignore what you're saying, and you need to make that impossible. You need to, and because when it gets to the Q&A section, which we'll see in some of the examples, they're going to try to cast doubt on your testimony, right? And they're going to press you on those details, and you need to be ready. So here are some examples of receipts in terms of proving that you're someone they should listen to. Maybe you've been in business in a long time for the community. Be ready to say the number of employees that you have, the jobs that you create, how you contribute to the local economy in specific verifiable ways. Any other community services that you supply, like, story times for kids or something like that. Anything like that is like, hey, if I disappear, if I'm harmed in any way, this is going to ripple through the community. And, if you're taking more of like the I'm a citizen of this community approach, how's the school or library benefited you or your kids? Those stories can really actually tug at the heartstrings in a way that is also speaking to things that will make the community better or worse. In terms of receipts for business impacts, anything that you can quantify, or in terms of cost, or in terms of staff hours or something like that, quantify it. It can be an estimate. Make sure that it's a reasonable estimate so that if they call you on it, they're not going to be able to discredit you. If it's not about cost, if it's not directly about cost, another way that you can kind of make that about cost is to talk about which parts of the bill are confusing to comply with. Because, if you have to go through every bill and say whether or not it's sexually relevant, the vagueness of that definition actually translates into staff hours that would need to be spent on compliance, right? So looking at that vagueness is part of it. If it's a situation where you might need to verify IDs at the door, that's potentially another staff person that you need to put on duty. Or, maybe you're a small store and you can't create an adults only section. Then suddenly that means you have to close your doors to minors. Right? So these are all ways that you can kind of spell out the impact that some of these bills can have on your store. And if it's a situation where you wouldn't be able to have a business relationship with a school that you've had potentially for many years, as was the case for many Texas booksellers, that's the kind of thing that you want to come in armed with numbers. Sometimes this can be a quick turnaround, but if a bill is introduced, as soon as it's introduced in a way that would impact you, try to start gathering your receipts, because with the climate that we're in, things tend to move quickly. So the last type of receipts that I'll talk about before, I'm going to skip a slide for the sake of time, but here are a few terms of art that are really useful when you're talking about the ways that a law violates your constitutional rights as a bookseller and as an individual. If you're prevented from saying something or receiving information, that is called prior restraint on speech. If you're forced to say something you don't want to say, like if you're forced to, for example, give a rating to a book based on a category that you think is bogus and doesn't make any sense, that's compelled speech. This last point, unfortunately, seems to be mattering less and less to the people who are making decisions, but it's still constitutional. It's still important. If the law is discriminatory, that could violate the Equal Protections Clause of the 14th Amendment. So I'm using these terms of art, and I'm encouraging you to use them, because that's going to set off alarm bells of, hey, this is the kind of thing people can use to sue us. And again, that comes back to money and it comes back to power, the things that are motivating these people. And if you can, show exactly where in the bill, quoting language, that those harms would be created. Okay, so I'm going to skip this slide, but briefly just be ready for hostile questions. And then the final step is repeat, drive your point home after you've sort of presented your receipts to remind everybody of what they've just heard. A few traps to avoid. Try not to lose your head. We've all wanted to be this. Look, I've been there. I've kicked over enough desks, not literally, that I've realized it doesn't really have the impact you want it to. So just try to be the reasonable one in the room, because the other side are sending some wackos, right? So if you can be the one who's making the rational argument, it's going to land. Try not to overcomplicate it. Yes, you're presenting receipts, but don't get into the weeds. Tell a simple story. That's how you can be impactful. Practice. Practice a 2-minute version. Practice a 1-minute version. Practice a 30-second version. Be ready. So, they'll just sort of nudge you, but they will cut your mic eventually. So this is, again, part of why the lead, having the lead right up front is so important, because you might only get that 30-second version. So now some examples. And we're going to watch testimony on HB 900 by our very, very own Charlie from Book People. Thank you, Charlie, for letting me use this. We're going to hear questions that were asked of Charlie's former colleague, who also testified. And they both testified, and they were both able to make related but subtly different arguments. And that was a very useful tactic, something that you can also employ if you have a bookseller who wants to participate. And then I included testimony from the incredible Laura Delaney. We're not going to have time to watch it, but again, it's in the slides, so you can watch that later. It's a really good example of booksellers offering testimony on library and school bills. And then we're going to look at some written testimony that was emailed to the committee by Michael Herman from New Hampshire of Gibson's. And this was Michael was sort of my point person who connected me to all the other New Hampshire booksellers, and were able to defeat a book rating bill last session. So it's a proven example. We know that one works. Okay, and the sound didn't work, so I had to pull this up on a different thing. Bear with me 1 second. Where's my mouse? Okay.
My name is Charlie Rasek, and I'm testifying against HB 900. I'm the CEO of Book People, the largest independent bookstore in Texas. Book People first opened its doors to the public in 1970 as Rock Books. Over the past 52 years, it's changed its name to Book People and has grown into a 4-story bookstore in downtown Austin. I personally have been a bookseller for over 25 years, starting at the age of 18 in Houston, Texas. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I have some serious concerns about the vendor requirements outlined in House Bill 900. Over the past few weeks, my coworker Megan and I have been contacting representatives and senators, noting why we think this bill would be impossible for book vendors like Book People to implement, therefore eliminating our existing relationships with schools and ultimately eliminating jobs at our business. HB 900 requires book vendors to rate books before selling them to schools. Expecting booksellers to personally read and rate every page of every book in print that might be ordered from them for a school is impossible. Book vendors do not create content, we fulfill orders for books. We rely on professional reviews and information provided by publishers to describe and categorize books for customers. The public, including librarians and educators, shop with us at will in the bookstore, online, at events, through purchase orders, and we do not rate or question anyone's purchases. This legislation would also require vendors to issue very subjective ratings for books sold to school districts that are in active circulation, as well as provide the list to DEA. For bookstores, this bill would require us to retroactively record every book ever purchased from us at the bookstore registers, or at a festival, or author event, or any other public setting that may have been brought for circulation into a school. This is not possible. We have never been required to keep these records, and we do not have a way to create them. Due to the lack of records, it would be impossible for us to rate all books we may have sold that are in active circulation after 52 years of business. I urge the committee to vote no on HB 900 due to lack of feasibility. Thank you.
Okay, first things first, round of applause for Charlie. That's just the beginning of everything that Charlie and Book People have done in fighting against this bill for the sake of all Texas booksellers. And I include this testimony because it is a perfect example. It does all of the things. Part of the way that I developed these steps for what makes good testimony is learning from testimony like Charlie's. So, but let's open it to some conversation. What did you see in there that made it effective? Yeah, raise your hand and then Ray, I'll give you the mic.
Yeah, I noticed that the credentials were stated up front and then right into like that point right away.
Yeah,
and
that
then
was
kind
that
of
first
getting
step.
into detail from there.
Introduce credentials, right? You know, this is how long the store has been in operation. This is how long I've been in the store doing this work. Great. What else?
In the testimony, it was very succinct on specifically how the bill would be impossible to carry out, how it would damage the relationships with schools, thereby costing jobs. So I think that was very to the point, and the receipts she had.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, really, it's a reading of the bill from the perspective of a bookseller, right? And that's what Charlie does so well, is sort of saying, here's how this would translate into my day-to-day. Go ahead.
A calm, level tone.
Yeah. Very reasonable, fact-based. Great. Anything else before we move on?
Yeah, on the tone, it was calm and level, but also you could feel the emotion and like how passionate Charlie was about it.
Yeah, and that's not a bad thing. I think it's not really something that you can imitate. It either happens or it doesn't. But if it happens, you're getting the best of both worlds. You're getting that reasonable, calm tone, but you're also showing the human impact of it.
In addition to that reasonable, calm tone, going out of the way to thank the people for the opportunity to speak, and in that way, subtly being like, we're on the same side, I am reasonable, and establishing that kind of vibe.
Yeah, and sometimes you have to give people the benefit of the doubt that they really don't deserve, right? And we can all know that, and it can still be a useful tactic to say, hey, I'm pretty sure that you don't want this to happen either, because we're all reasonable here, right? But surely you don't want to punish small businesses, and you don't want to eliminate jobs. Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to move on, and I think I'm going to have to skip the question and answer example. But the thing that I'll emphasize there is that the questions that are leveled against the testimony of Charlie and her colleague Megan are essentially, one is saying, hey, this is really enlightening. We've killed bills here before just because they would make it harder for someone to buy a puppy from a pet store. And then another one, Angela Paxton, who is the author of many of the worst of these bills, then tries to cast doubt on some of the details. She seizes on one minor point and tries to discredit the entire testimony by discrediting that point. So this is what when you're preparing your testimony, you need to cross-examine it. You need to anticipate a hostile witness. Or hostile whatever. Hey. Sorry, this is really hard to do on a different screen. Okay. Oh my God, where did it go now? There we go. No? Okay. Again, I encourage you to watch the other video testimonies later. But for now, I just want to briefly highlight how this translated into testimony from Michael Herman of Gibson's Books in New Hampshire. We saw again these steps: the introduction, emphasizing, the place of the store, how long it's been in business, etc. There's the lead. It comes pretty early, maybe could even be earlier, actually. Here are the receipts that are focused on the vagueness of the standards and the difficulty of complying. And there's the repeat at the end. Now, this was written testimony, but all the same stuff applies. And here, for good measure, is that undeserved benefit of the doubt that we're talking about. It's really, really important because it's going to allow someone to not, to feel like they should listen to you. Okay, so I said we were going to do some writing. Now it's time. So take out whatever you want to write with. And again, if you need a pad of paper and a pen, there's some up here and there are some in the back. If you want to write on your computer or phone, whatever, that's all great. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to try to help you write the lead that you would use for a specific type of bill that I'll ask you to choose in a second. And then you can just think about, you don't have to get the receipts, but just think about what receipts you might look for to substantiate that point. So first, take a second, pick which type of bill you want to work with here. Again, it's going to be one that creates liability for bookstores by changing obscenity standards. It could be something that mandates a book ban policy. I guess actually that first point should be a statewide book ban process. So mandating the creation of a bad book ban policy, forcing booksellers to rate books, or expanding the definition of obscenity. So think about a little bit about which one you want to use, and then take a few minutes here and try to write the lead. Like, what is the argument that you would actually use to try to defeat that kind of bill? And you're going to have to share with the person next to you, right? That's how this always goes, so be ready. And when you've done that, start thinking about, wow, sorry, Lisa Simpson just jumped in. When you've done that, try to think about what are some of the receipts that you would include. I also should have had Ray lock the doors before I said that we were going to do some writing, because there was a little exodus. And whenever you've thought of a receipt or two, just compare notes with your partner, with whoever's next to you, and, groups of 2 or 3. And at that point, try to listen and see if there's any constructive feedback that you can give. Think about it skeptically. Imagine that you're someone who doesn't want to listen. Okay. I want to make sure that we have time for some questions. I know that you have much more to say, and a reminder that you can continue these conversations in the hallway and resume them. But did that raise any questions? Go ahead. Oh yeah, sorry, thank you.
Hey, I'm Jackie from the Links in Gainesville, Florida, and I also come to this as somebody who's a lawyer and worked in a legislative committee in the past. And I hear the arguments for fighting obscenity and saying, well, it put a lot of burden on me to have to rate all these books. But me as the committee employee, I would say, well, then why don't we just make the publishers do this instead? So I guess my concern is not making a roadmap for somebody to then just change the bill in the next committee.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would also say, we have to fight the fight that's in front of us and get ready to fight that one. But I think I would also say that's why it's so important to talk about the constitutional harms that are done not just to booksellers, but to authors and to readers. It's a great point. Thank you, Jackie.
So this is Taylor from Liberation is Lit in South Carolina. Thanks. So for the most part, most of these harmful mandates are coming directly from the State Department of Education. How would you recommend, because those are the places I mostly testify, because it's not so much coming out of the State House, but how would you recommend tweaking this? Because so far my testimony has been as a former person in higher education, me personally as a former student in the South Carolina education system, how would you bring in the business aspect as far as providing receipts within a testimony to school districts?
Yeah, it's a great point. So I'll answer your question directly first, and then I have sort of a follow-up. One, I mean, I think that you can talk about the impact on the next generation of readers, right? I think that that is a place where having fewer books available that people are going to connect with and that people are going to get excited about, and sort of the disproportionate impact on marginalized voices in these bands, that's a place where, you know, these are whole groups of students for whom reading is going to become less attractive, right? So that's point one. Point two, in South Carolina specifically, a bill has actually been introduced, and if it's a messaging bill, it's probably not going to go anywhere, right? But there has been a bill that's been introduced to short circuit that process and essentially send the power back to the community level. And so that, I think, is a place where there is an opportunity to kind of make some difference there. But when you're testifying specifically to the tribunals on books, I would say focus on the next generation of readers.
Hi, my name is Jennifer. I'm from the Book Catapult in San Diego. As I was doing this exercise, I was trying to look at it from the opposing, action. What are they going to ask?
Great.
And trying to think of what we could realistically do. So I looked at the idea of book ratings.
Mm-hmm.
We couldn't rate every book in our children's department. Absolutely, that would be impossible. But I thought, well, maybe we could rate the picture books. Those are a little more, accessible. They're shorter. They're easier. Or we could take 10 books that we all read and rate. But I wondered if does that specificity become more convoluted, or does it help to give perspective to say, well, I could review 100 books, but then how would that provide a service for my community to only have 100 books? Or does that, like she said, either give the roadmap or become unnecessarily complicated in the argument? Like, I guess I'm trying to create the specifics to say, oh, well, we just don't have the staff. But I feel like the clapback from that is going to be like, well, make the time, or do you really care about your business, or whatever the argument's going to be. Like, how specific do you get without getting mired in the weeds, I guess?
Yeah, so there's two sort of split questions here. I want to clarify that it's useful to think about counter arguments in order to prepare your questions and make your positive testimony as effective as possible and as insulated from attack as possible. I don't think that you should include those counter arguments in your testimony, right? That is something that if you were doing an op-ed, I would encourage you to have like a rhetorical concession or something, right? But in this, it's so tight and you don't want to give them any ammo that they don't already have. So I wouldn't include it. In terms of the not getting into the weeds question, think about like, what's the one sentence version of it? If you're getting too in the weeds, think about like, what's the point of what you're trying to say? And then just write the point. If there are follow-up questions, then that might be a case where you want to go into more detail, but try to keep it simple and try to keep it focused on your argument in the testimony itself.
Hi, Kelsey from Diesel Bookstore in Los Angeles. I was thinking about this because we had a situation this past year of a group wanting us to ban a specific book we had. And then we were getting support from the opposite end where people were coming in and being like, absolutely don't do that. If you do that, I won't shop here anymore. Sort of the opposite side of it. So I was just wondering, in something like if you're going somewhere and trying to these like state book bans or something, is it helpful to point out the community support that you know that you have, that you have community members behind you that are standing for you, or would, on the opposite side, stop shopping there if now they probably wouldn't do it if it was like a statewide thing, but people were saying if we had banned said book, they would stop shopping there because they don't think book bans are
it's a great question. One, I would say yes. If you're hearing from customers that they're against this, absolutely bring that in. Two, I think that's a good example of the reputational harm that would be done to you if you are complying with a certain law, because people don't, and this was the case in Texas with HB 900, part of the concern was that the names of these stores that did the ratings and the ratings that they gave them would have been published on the state education website. And so suddenly this is speech that is being attributed to a store that didn't want to make those statements in the first place, right? So that was part of the strategy. But I would also say this is a great example, and I know Diesel's situation specifically. This is a great example of the way that laws targeting schools and libraries spill over into the bookstore. It creates an expectation that whenever there's a book that you don't like, that you can force people to remove it. And for bookstores, that's just not true. But it doesn't stop people from using any means at their disposal to attack books that they don't like.
I just want to say thank you for the focusing on the business side, because I think as booksellers, like I've been to our school board, and it's often defending the books, right? It's our passion. And so this takes it to a different level. So that I so appreciate that. And then I also wanted to respond to, could we talk about picture books and rate those? Well, how would we rate Tango for 3? I don't think we can do that. Not according to their standards.
Yeah,
So.
exactly. And there are all sorts of things like the implication of sex that like then become this whole other vague category.
Hi, Emil from Riverside Bookstore in Oswego, New York. So first of all, thank you for all these great tips and all the info. We've been talking a lot about these case-by-case issues, state to state, but we've already seen movement on a federal level with certain things regarding book bans and things like that. Is there any recourse there, and what kind of strategies do we have there to deal with those things? Because some of that is just simply by mandate, and it's like, haha, gotcha. Now this is true, right? So
Yeah.
There's less of a process by which we can sort of jump in and intervene. It's kind of challenging after the fact, it seems.
Yeah, 100%. In terms of, so one thing that I just want us all to say as often as possible, executive orders are not laws, right? That said, sometimes they are treated as laws, and it takes litigation to stop them from being treated as laws. And on the federal level, the best thing that we can do, given the current outlook, let's say, is I just passed up so many ruder ways to say that. The best thing we can do, given the current outlook, is to try to stop anything impacting books from happening on the federal level right now, because if anything happens that the people in power want to happen, it will be bad, right? Happily, I don't think that there would be the votes to overcome a filibuster on any kind of federal legislation. But in terms of executive orders, this is something where really litigation is the thing, right? So I think for us in this moment, I think we just kind of have to wait. If there's a situation where you have been impacted, you can reach out to your local ACLU or reach out to me, and I'll see if there's anyone I can connect you with in case you would make a good plaintiff or something like that. Lauren, you want to add?
Oh, yeah, just want to add something.
Yeah, please. Right. Or where's the...
Well, I would be a great friend. Oh,
Incredible.
I think they were trying to. This has been so amazing. And I just want to say one thing, which is in going forward, this is not a question, this is just a statement. Do not comply in advance in any way, right? So no matter what we do, we are not complying in advance until we are forced to comply, and we're still not complying.
Yeah.
Right? That's all I want to say.
Yeah.
So if you say, don't give them that ground, right? Don't say, yes, we are going to rate these picture books. We're not going to do that.
And part of the harm that is done by these bills that impact schools and libraries is that everyone is so terrified of liability that they not only comply in advance, but they over-comply, right? And that's the kind of thing that we as booksellers cannot do under no circumstances. So don't comply in advance. If at all possible, don't comply at all. But, I didn't say that. All right, Ray just told me that we're over time. So thank you, everyone, for everything that you're doing every day. Claire, please don't quote me on saying don't comply at all.
Thank you for listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA site at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!